as you know, the topic for today's webinar is El Nino in a changing climate. And we felt that with all of the reportage coming out about El Nino and its anticipated implications for not just us here in the Caribbean, but certainly around the world with changing patterns, we felt it was important for us to maybe highlight this in the context of a changing climate, because a lot of the reportage is happening against the backdrop of climate change and everything we know it's bringing. So we're happy to have with us someone who knows a lot about El Nino and La Nina, Mr. Gary Benjamin, who, just so you can have a sense of his background, he started in the field of meteorology with the TTMS in 1981, first as a weather observer and eventually a meteorologist. He also has experience in as an aeronautical meteorologist, synoptic analyst, and weather forecaster, and considerable experience as well in analyzing and predicting the state of the atmosphere. He also is trained in basic climatology and agrometeorology, very appropriate for what we're talking about here today. And he's done, well, a lot of work, including several FEMA courses in emergency management. He's a trained and certified licensed amateur radio operator. He has a technician diploma in telecommunication systems, BSc in information technology from UE, and is a member of REACT. And he's currently employed with the TTMS as a meteorologist, but based mostly in communication. So we do have the right person with us this afternoon to tell us a lot more about the science of the phenomena that is El Nino. Gary, you can take it away.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. A pleasant good afternoon. In the little time I have, I'll try to give you a basic understanding of what the ENSO is, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So if I can have the slides up, I would go ahead, please. The slide presentation.
Yes, Omar will bring that up for you.
Okay, next, this is just the front slide, so you can go on to the next one. All right, what is an ENSO, or the El Nino Southern Oscillation? It is a periodic climate pattern of the warming and cooling of the surface waters of central and eastern equatorial Pacific Ocean. In this slide, you would see at the west coast of South America, the reds, which are deeper reds, means warmer. And as you go further west, you see a long tongue of warm water. And that is showing a thermal image of what the El Nino part of it looks like. So there are three sections to El Nino, or the ENSO. One is the neutral phase, or the normal phase. And two is the cool phase, or La Nina. And three is the warm phase, the one which we always talk about. So next slide, please. This is a thermal imaging of the sea surface temperatures. On the left side is the western coast of South America, and to on the right side is the western coast of South America, and to the left is the western Pacific Ocean, close to Australia and Indonesia. And you would see in El Nino, you see the reds meaning warm, showing warm, and the blues showing in La Nina showing a cool. Next slide, please. So Gilbert Walker, one of the scientists and climatologists in the 1930s, determined that the El Nino occurs simultaneously with what we know as the Southern Oscillation. And the Southern Oscillation really is as a result of pressure differences across the equatorial Pacific. So in the Northern Hemisphere, you will find high pressures moving clockwise out of the high pressure, and high pressures in the Southern Hemisphere moving counterclockwise. And this slide is showing you how the motions from the south and the north come together, make a strong flow across the equatorial Pacific. And normally, strong trade winds blow westward across the tropical Pacific, as you can see there. And these winds push the warm surface water towards the western Pacific, where it borders Australia. So when the surface air pressure changes in the southern Pacific Ocean between the eastern high cell or the eastern higher pressure and the lower pressures to the west. The wind across the Pacific will either become stronger or weaker as the case of the pressure differences might dictate. And when the pressure differences increase, the wind strengthens, and conversely, when it decreases, the winds break down. So that, next slide, please. In order to understand the development of El Nino, it is important to be familiar with the El Nino neutral conditions in the Pacific Ocean. Due to the warm trade winds, the sea surface is normally about 0.5 meters, about 1.5 to 2 feet higher in the Western Pacific, and also about 7 degrees to 10 degrees Celsius warmer in the western areas, warmer than in the east near Ecuador. So it is warmer normally in the western areas. And the westward movement of warmer waters causes cooler waters to rise up towards the surface on the coast of Ecuador, or the western coast of South America, that is Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. And this process is known as upwelling, as you can see there. So you would notice that it is, as I said, higher on one side and lower because the wind is skimming the water across to the west. Next slide, please. Next slide after this. So in the different conditions with the El Niños, we have with the ENSO, we see a pattern, a normal pattern where the equatorial winds gather the waters towards the west, and we have cold upwelling along the East Pacific or the western coast of South America, and that is the normal conditions. And El Nino conditions, the warm water approaches the South American coast, and we have the absence therefore of upwelling and colder water in those areas. And we have a greater tongue of warm water. And as the La Nina conditions come in, we see the warmer waters to the further to the east. And why is that important, really, and where the warmer waters are positioned? It is so because that is where we would have the strongest and deepest convections develop and setting up the pattern for what we know as the Walker circulations. And therefore, these areas of warmer waters would have the greatest convection and the greatest rainfall, and the other cooler areas would have more suppressed rainfall amounts. Next slide, please. So there are criteria for the El Nino as we are speaking and given the whole El Nino, La Nino scenario, the ENSO. So with El Nino, the criteria, the average sea surface temperature across the equatorial Pacific is at least 0.5 degrees Celsius or 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than average in the preceding month. And the anomaly has to be persisting, or is expected to persist for 5 consecutive overlapping 3 months period. Like we look at the climate in 3 months period, for instance, January, February, March, and then February, March, April, etc. The atmosphere over the tropical Pacific then would exhibit one or more of changes commonly associated with the El Nino. That is weaker than usual easterly trade winds, reduced cloudiness and rainfall over Indonesia, and a corresponding increase in the average surface pressure, or increased cloudiness and rainfall in central or eastern or the eastern part of the basin, and a corresponding drop in the average surface pressure. Next slide, please. So the La Nina is just the opposite, where we find it being cooler than usual by the same criteria, and the anomaly has to persist for the same consecutive overlapping 3-month periods. And the atmosphere over the tropical Pacific begins to exhibit changes, such as stronger than usual easterly trade winds, an increase in cloudiness and rainfall over Indonesia, and a corresponding drop in average surface pressure, a decrease in cloudiness and rainfall in the eastern tropical Pacific, and an increase in the average surface pressure. Next slide, please. Remember, I mentioned a man named Walker. These circulations are named after Walker. And the neutral phase, this is showing the neutral phase as the circulations are set up, where you have warmer water to the western areas. And then you have, therefore, upwelling, and the turbocline comes closer to the surface, and cooler waters in the east. And we see how the rise in convection is mostly on the eastern side, on the western side, sorry, of the Pacific. Go ahead, please. Next slide. So when we look at El Nino and the changes in the temperatures of the surface waters, we find that convection operating in different areas, and therefore the Walker circulation changes according to the slide. And you will see convection occurring in the central Pacific and also in the eastern Pacific, because the warmer than normal waters are in that area, and the turbocline remains steady. Next slide, please. And with the La Nina is just like a much stronger phase than the neutral condition. So we see most of the warm water is pushed part of the western areas, and the convective currents are stronger, and the sinking currents on the western side become stronger, and the sinking currents on the eastern side become stronger sinking. And there's even more upwelling and therefore more cooling of the eastern side of the Pacific. Next slide, please. So when we look at the slide shows the Walker circulations on a more global scale, we see the sinking waters over, for the El Nino, we see the sinking currents mostly over Trinidad and the Caribbean area. And we see where the convective currents are strongest. And the La Nina phase, we see that we have convective currents over the Caribbean area. Go ahead, please. So a more wider scale of that would show you under neutral conditions where we have the convective activity, and therefore more greater rainfall. The width of the arrows which show the strength in the convective activity. And look towards our area to the right of the slide, you will see it in neutral conditions. We have convective activity going on across the Caribbean, so it would not stop or prevent development in the neutral phase as far as weather is concerned in our area. Next slide, please. As we look at the El Nino conditions, when the Walker cells have shifted because of the temperature shifts in the surface, we see a sinking of the air around the Caribbean area. So therefore, we have a kind of suppression of the atmosphere in a general sense across the Caribbean, and the convective activity takes place elsewhere as the Walker circulations changes. Next slide, please. And the La Nina, of course, look at the arrows and overall area. The La Nina has enhanced and stronger convection over the Caribbean, enhanced and stronger sinking air over the eastern Pacific, and to the western Pacific, we have enhanced and stronger upward convection. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide, really, and it just shows for different times of the year what is likely to happen in the different phases. The first slide shows the El Nino effects during December through to February, where our area is normally wet and cool. Remember, December to February is basically winter in the Northern Hemisphere. And the slide below, we show from March to November, so that we would see the dry and warm areas at that time, and this is generally speaking, in the El Nino conditions. Next slide, please. And the final slide is showing the La Nina effects basically during the winter, where we will be dry and warm, and we have a bit of wetness just to the south of us. And of course, in the summertime or rainy season time, we see wet and cool conditions. So that means it has been enhanced, the convection has been enhanced in La Nina over us. And we notice that we could remember last 3 years when we had the La Nina, how we had these events and bouts of rainfall together, of course, with the Madden-Julian oscillation. So the El Nino, La Nina, the stronger it becomes, the more the effects of it spread globally. If it is a weak El Nino or weak La Nina, the effects may not be as noticed as the stronger it gets. There's teleconnections in the atmosphere. So you find and notice the effects of El Nino or La Nina across greater areas of the globe. And therefore, the phenomena, together with the water circulation setup, together with the pressure differences between the east and the west of the equatorial Pacific, and together with the different currents, we find that this is what we call the ENSO, or the El Nino Southern Oscillation. Next slide, please. So thank you for your attention. I've tried to go through this as quickly as I can and as basic as I can, but the El Nino phenomenon is still even being studied today by scientists. And therefore, there's a lot more that we can talk about the different areas of El Nino and the different effects. But that is it for me as for the basic effects and what the ENSO is.
Thank you very much, Gary, for that. We appreciate that sort of overview, and I imagine it's very much an overview sort of whittled down for the audience that we have here. Thanks for considering that as well.